Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zvachim Daf Nun Aleph. Today's daf is sponsored by Caroline Ben Ari in honor of her 70th birthday, with boundless love for my daughters and appreciation for the care and support they show me. Today's daf is sponsored by Ann Klausner in honor of Caroline Ben Ari's special birthday. May she continue to grow and enjoy the wisdom imparted on this very special group and spread the light of Torah and love of Eretz U'Medinat Yisrael ad 120. Mazal Tov. We're going to get started today with we got a lucky break after yesterday, because besides that the next section that we're going to try to learn, can we learn this from that, they're going to kind of say we don't really have too much evidence to show for except for one. So we'll finish all those complicated limudim. And the second is, if you look quickly at Amud Bet, it's 3 lines long. So I think it's the prize for getting through yesterday's stuff. We will get started with the chart from yesterday, and I'm going to share my screen. I updated it a little bit based on today, and I shortened it a little bit so that we'd have room to fit everything. Okay, I'm just going to, a second. Okay, so I'm going to share, actually that's not the one I'm going to share. Where did it go? Here it is. Okay. I also made a summary at the end of a really small chart on the second side of the page to summarize everything so you could see it at a glance without all the details that we used yesterday. So if you look at a glance, we had Davar Lamei Behekesh. If you learn with juxtaposition, we said, no, you can't learn another Hekesh. You can't learn a Gzeira Shava. You can learn a Kal Vachomer, at least according to the Tana D'Bei Rabbi Yishmael. And Binyan Av, we're going to see in all the cases, everything about a Binyan Av is going to be under this category of we don't know. Okay, in the end. Now, we did say yesterday, if you remember, the very last thing we ended up with was you could do a Binyan Av after a Kal Vachomer. That was Rabbi Yirmiyah who brought Rabbi Meir's approach, which we're going to get back to. But in today's daf, we're actually going to reject it. So we're going to end up with unknown. So everything about a Binyan Av is unknown, which we're going to see. I'm already jumping the gun and giving away what's going to be today, which is the next category is what about a Binyan Av? Can you learn a Hekesh after that? Can you learn Gzeira Shava? Remember, a Binyan Av is a paradigm. So in the end, nothing can be learned about a paradigm. Not can we learn it after we've learned something else, and not can we start with that and then learn something else. Even though we will have one attempt to answer that question, we're going to try with a Binyan Av and a Binyan Av, but that's also going to be rejected. So Hekesh, we had no, yes, right? And if you remember, a lot of all the later ones were built on this theory that, oh, look, this shows Kal Vachomer, the fact that you could do a Hekesh and then a Kal Vachomer shows the Kal Vachomer has a certain strength. And that's why we ended up with yes in almost all the questions about the Kal Vachomer, right? If it learns, then we had on the other extreme, if you learn it by Kal Vachomer, can you learn a Hekesh? Can you learn a Gzeira Shava? Can you learn a Kal Vachomer? In the end, we said yes to almost everything, except that both by Gzeira Shava and by Kal Vachomer, can you do a Hekesh after them, is a machloket. And one machloket dependent on the other, if you remember, because whether you can do a Hekesh after a Gzeira Shava depended on whether you accept Rav Papa from the Maaser or Mar Zutra, who said, what are you talking about? That's Chulin, that doesn't teach you anything for here. Because remember, this chart is only Kodshim. And then the Kal Vachomer, can you do a Hekesh after a Kal Vachomer, all depended on whether you say Gzeira Shava yes. If you say Gzeira Shava yes, then Kal Vachomer to the Kal Vachomer. If you say Gzeira Shava no, then there's no Kal Vachomer to make, and then you can't learn to the Kal Vachomer. So that's that one. And then we had, once you say yes to Gzeira Shava, for sure you're going to say yes to Kal Vachomer, because, again, all these logical inferences, all based on the first line, cases 2 and 3. Since Hekesh, you can't learn a Gzeira Shava, but you can learn a Kal Vachomer, that's going to put Kal Vachomer in a stronger position. Okay, and we went back and we had all these limudim. Okay, we ended with Rabbi Yirmiyah. So because we have a little extra time today, I'm going to go back to Rabbi Yirmiyah and explain it a little bit better. We were there at the end of Daf and kind of glossed over Rabbi Yehuda's opinion because it wasn't so important for our purposes, but now today we have time, we'll go back and we'll explain. So again, let's just go through Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah is trying to teach, if you have a Kal Vachomer, can you then do a Binyan Av? So what they're going to basically say is, Rabbi Yirmiyah is going to say the following. We're trying to figure out if in the temple, with the Kohen de Malika, which is the way you slaughter in the temple, but it's not slaughtering, it's something else, right? He takes his finger and goes in the back of the neck and kills the animal that way, not with a knife, not cutting the trachea and esophagus the way you normally do. So we have a bird. The bird is a treifa. That means the bird is sick, not going to make it not going to live 12 months. Okay, we'll get to all the treifas when we get to Chulin. Now, normally, in an animal, if you slaughter a treifa animal, it doesn't have the impurity of a nevela. Okay, nevela and treifa are sort of similar because they're both non-kosher meats. Okay, they're both piece of meat that's not kosher. Why is it not kosher? Well, the treifa is because the animal was sick before you killed it. You're not allowed to slaughter an animal like that or eat you sort of slaughter it, but if you slaughter it and try to eat it, it's not kosher. That's where the word treif comes from, even though treif doesn't really mean that, right? Treif means just non-kosher. But treifat is really a non-kosher animal, but it's really not a non-kosher animal. You can't eat it because it was sick before you slaughtered it. It could be a kosher, it was usually a kosher animal to begin with, but it's not kosher for you because it was sick. Then there's nevela, which is the animal wasn't slaughtered properly or wasn't slaughtered at all, just died. Okay, that's a carcass of a dead animal. Can't eat that. But in addition, the fact that you can't eat a nevela and you can't eat a treifa, there's a difference between them because there's impurity of a nevela. Okay, that means that if you touch it or carry it without touching it, but you carry it and move it, you're tummy. But that's only for a nevela. If you slaughtered a treifa animal, it wouldn't have that. Now we go to the birds. Birds have a different kind of tumah, of the nevela. You have a kosher animal that died, kosher bird, that died on its own, right? Wasn't slaughtered properly. It has nevela, it has tumah beit habliya. That means while it's in your mouth, if you touch it, right, while it's in your mouth, if you were eating it, that's when you have impurity. Okay, you're impure at that moment while it's in your mouth. Now, that's a weaker kind of impurity. We don't know anything whether shchita removes nevela from a treifa. Like, let's say now, let's move to the parallel case of the animal that we discussed. We have a bird that's kosher bird, but it's a treifa. So now we can't eat it, right? What if we slaughter it? Does it have tumat nevela or not? So that's the big question. And the real question that we want to get to is, what if it was in the temple and we did malika to it, to this treifa bird? Does that remove the nevela? So what we really talked about was Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir said, yes. In other words, it's going to remove the issue of tumat nevela because we slaughtered it or because we did malika. How do we get to malika? Well, we're going to say shchita is learned out from, if we slaughtered the bird, it would be learned out from the animal, because the animal has a higher level of impurity for nevela, and yet the slaughtering removes this treifa animal from becoming called the nevela and having the impurity. So if in the stringent law we're going to be lenient, then in the lenient law, which it's only tumah beit habliya, while it's in your mouth, you're impure. Otherwise, touch it, you carry it, you're not impure. So all the more so, the shechita is going to remove. There's going to be no nevela if it was a treifa animal that was slaughtered properly. Again, it's not going to be kosher. It's just a matter that doesn't have the impurity of nevela. And then that's the kal vachomer. And then there's the binyan av, which is, since we say shechita permits the bird to be eaten if it was a kosher bird and it wasn't a treifa, and malika does the same thing in the temple, because malika you can't do outside the temple. If you do it outside the temple, it's not kosher, but in the temple you can't. Both allow something to be eaten. That's as mechal shalta ba'achila. It enables it to be eaten. Then we can do a paradigm. They're the same thing, basically. Shechita is like malika, so it's true for shechita, it's true for malika, and that's how he does a binyan av, and then a binyan av on something that was a kal vachomer. And that was our proof. Okay, but within that, we did Rabbi Yehuda, and we didn't yet get to Rabbi Yossi, because that's in today's daf. So let's go to Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi. These are irrelevant for the flow of the Gemara, but they're here because they're in that source that we quoted, that Rabbi Yirmiyah quoted to us to show Rabbi Meir. So they each have two other positions here. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, mitama bebeit habliya. He says very simply that a nevela of tahor that was either slaughtered or malika, either which one, it's nevela, okay? Because the fact that we can slaughter, he doesn't hold by this kal vachomer, and for sure not then there's no binyan av if there's no kal vachomer. He basically holds that it's true that slaughtering an animal, proper kosher shechita of an animal, will remove the issue of nevela, if it's a treifa, so it might not be kosher, but there's no tumat nevela. But that's only true for an animal. It's not true for a bird. So for a bird, there's tumat beit habliya for slaughtering it, and then obviously also for malika. Okay, if it's a treifa, it's going to have tumat nevela to it. And Rabbi Yossi, now starting with the top of our daf, Omer, he has an in-between position. Daya kenevela behema torah sheshchitata metarata velo malikata. He's saying, listen, I'm going to agree with the first part, the Kal V'chomer, just not the Binyan Av, because what's he going to say? If you remember, by a Kal V'chomer, he doesn't use these words, but the commentaries use these words, which is Dayo Lavam Adin Liot Kanidon. If you're going to learn something from a Kal V'chomer, what do you learn? You learn what the din is for an animal, which is slaughtering. There is no malika for an animal. So we can take slaughtering of an animal. That removes the nevela issue, even though the animal's a treifa. And we can learn from there to slaughtering a bird. But we can't go any farther than that and take it to malika. So that's why he says daya. In other words, it's just enough, meaning stop here. Okay, do part of what Rabbi Meir said, but not the whole thing, right? Rabbi Yehuda didn't agree with anything Rabbi Meir said. He says, I'm going to take one thing you're saying, but it has to be like the nevela of a kosher bird. Only the shchita permits it, not malika. So we can't get to malika. Okay? Even though it's similar, doesn't matter. Now, that was all an aside. But really, Rabbi Meir did take a Kal V'chomer and then a Binyan Av. But now the Gemara is going to reject it for the obvious reason, if you didn't catch this before, Velohi. Hatam tavihi mishchita dechulin ka'atya. But again, same problem we have with Rav Papa. Rav Papa learned out from Maaser Sheni to Shlamim to Toda. Now Maaser Sheni was chulin. So you can't learn from chulin. It wasn't sacrificial items. You can't learn from non-sacrificial items. Likewise here. We're learning from shchita of an animal, which is chulin. And we're learning from there to shchita of a bird, which is chulin. And then we want to learn from there to kachim. So of course you could do that because that's the world of chulin for the most part. And this, we're looking for things that are kachim. Okay? Remember, we've had this before. When we say it's a unique law for kachim, is it in the end we're learning to kachim because we're learning to malika? Does it matter the end of what you want to learn, or is it the parts that you're learning it from? What determines that we're in the category of kachim? And that's the machloket here. Is it the end, the malika, and then you would say this is kachim? Or if it's the thing that you're learning it from, well, that's all chulin. So then that wouldn't necessarily, again, it's a machloket, and that's the machloket here. So it's unclear. Okay? Next. Davar halamed b'binyan av, maushi halamed. Now here they're going to ask the question about all of them because they're not going to have answers, as I told you. So there we went one by one because each time we had an answer. Here they're just going to give the whole list. If you start with a paradigm, can you do a hekesh, gzer shava, b'kal v'chomer, b'binyan av? Can you do one of those after the paradigm? To which the Gemara responds, pshot me'achada. We can at least learn one. That's all we have. We only have an answer to one of them, which is the last one. We're going to have a case of a binyan av and a binyan av, but I already did tell you we're going to reject this. So let's start. Here goes a long braita. Only the beginning is important for our purposes, just like the previous one. Only one part was important, but we brought the whole thing. The main subject here is if you have certain items that are disqualified and should not go on the altar, but you put them on the altar anyway. We've already discussed this in a bunch of situations. Do you leave it on the altar or do you have to take it off, right? There's certain disqualifications that are so bad that even if you put them on the altar, you take them off. But many of them, once it goes on the altar, it's like the altar kind of absorbs it and it becomes belonging to the altar. And it's sort of, you could say, removes the disqualification, not really remove it completely, but it allows it to stay on the altar. So what it really means is ideally don't put it there, but b'di'evet, if it was already there, you can leave it post facto. So now we want to know, why did they say you can leave it for all the following items? So they're going to have one by one. Why, if you put this one on the altar, can you leave it there? Why, if you put this one, can you leave it there? And we're going to have different reasons. The first one is what's important. Mipnei ma amru lan bedam kasher. You're going to have this whole ring to this whole line, okay? Lan bedam means, lan is you left it overnight. The blood, we all know what happens. You can't leave the blood overnight. The day you slaughter the animal, you have to put it on the altar. Let's say you left it overnight, and the next day you put it on the altar. So, mipnei ma amru, for what reason did they say lan bedam kasher? If you left the dam overnight and then put it on the altar, you'd be able to leave it on there. Shaharei lan be'imulim kasher. Lan bedam is okay because lan be'imulim is okay. Now, what's lan be'imulim? You're also supposed to burn the parts of, right, there's certain parts, certain fats, and the lobe of the liver, right? We talked about those different parts, the kidneys, supposed to be burned on the altar. If you didn't do it that day, they have to be burnt that day. If you left them overnight, they actually become disqualified. But the next day you came in, let's say your korban was Sunday, and Monday morning you come into the temple and you realize, right? Sometimes you get down, in the morning and you realize the food was left out all night, right? It's like that kind of thing. And you get down in the morning, you go into the temple and you see nobody dealt with it. And you say, I got to fix this right away, right? Sometimes you just immediately have to fix it and you put it on the altar, even though you know that's the wrong thing to do. You just feel like, it didn't get burned. And you throw it on the altar, we leave it. So now, we don't know why Lam B'imurim is okay. But what we're basically building is a paradigm. Since Lam B'imurim doesn't have to go off the altar, also Lam B'dam, also the blood that was left overnight doesn't have to come off the altar. Now, Lam B'imurim kasher, where do we get that from? Shaharei lam bebasal kasher. Okay, now this is a little different. If you leave the meat and you don't eat it, okay, let's say, right, you get there the next morning and you realize you didn't eat the meat. Now, we're talking about a shlamim. Now, if you didn't eat the meat of the shlamim, what happens the next day? Nothing. You could still eat it. It's totally fine because the shlamim, if you remember, you have a day, a night, and a day. You have 2 days and a night to eat it, which basically comes into the day you sacrifice. It's Sunday, Sunday night, and Monday you can eat it. So if Monday morning comes along and you haven't eaten the meat, it's totally fine. So obviously there are sacrifices where it's not, but the shlamim, it's totally fine. So they say like this, since the meat can still be eaten that day, therefore, if you didn't do the imurim that day, it's okay. We're going to have a big problem with this. This makes no sense logically, really, because even though you could say, okay, the meat is okay, so we'll say the imurim are okay, which then means we'll say the dam is okay, which, by the way, there's our paradigm. Meat teaches you to imurim, and imurim teaches you to dam. The problem with this is very clear, and I'll just say it right now in case you're thinking, what? So the Gemara is going to ask this question and say, this makes no sense. The meat is actually totally fine. Okay, let's take our comparison of leaving food out overnight. Let's say you didn't unpack your vegetables, from the store overnight, or let's say you left out a pot of soup, or a pot of chicken soup, okay? So if you get down in the morning, your chicken soup is ruined, but your vegetables are totally fine because they can live outside the refrigerator. So you wouldn't say, oh, I could keep my soup because the vegetables are, right, the whole vegetables are fine and not ruined, so my soup isn't ruined. That's ridiculous, right? So that's the comparison here, where you can't learn from the meat, which is totally kosher, to something that actually became disqualified and then you threw it on the altar. So that's what we're going to get back to. But right now, it looks like this works. Binyan av and a binyan av, and right, basar is okay the next day. So because the basar is okay, also the imurim are going to be okay if you put them on the altar, and also then we'll learn from there to the blood if you put it on the altar. Now we're up to this bright. I told you we're just going to quote everything in the bright, even though the rest is irrelevant for us, because that already taught us binyan av, and we're not going to have binyan avs anymore, or maybe a little, but not a binyan av on a binyan av. Yotze, ho'il v'yotze kasher bebama. Let's say I take the meat out of I took the imurim outside the azara. Now I disqualified them by taking them out of the azara. And then I bring them back in and I put them on the altar. So that's okay. I can leave them on the altar. Why? Again, none of these things are okay. But if I put them on the altar, I can leave them. Ho'il v'yotze kasher bebama. Because Yotze is not such a serious thing. How do we know? Because in the time when there is no temple, if you were to bring something outside the space of where the Azara used to be, right, and you bring it on any random altar, you're allowed to do that. That's bamot, right? When there's no Beit HaMikdash, there's a heter bamot, and you can bring it. So Yotze is not such a serious issue because when there is no temple, it's okay. We're going to have the same problem there because that's completely kasher, and this is, again, disqualified. It's not really the same thing. Tameh, okay, if the meat became impure and then you put it on the altar. Ho'il v'hutar b'avodat tzibur. So you don't have to take it off. Why? Because there's a big heter for tumah. What's that big heter? We always talk about it. Tumah hutra b'tzibur. That if the majority of the people are impure, you're allowed to bring public sacrifices. So here you have tameh. Could be if things are impure, okay, or people are impure, you're allowed to bring sacrifices even in unique circumstances. So therefore, again, in this circumstance, it's not. But since you already put it on the altar, we're not going to make you take it off. Chutz lizmano. This is, again, getting us back into the world of pigul. If there was a pigul, the sacrifice was done in a pigul manner, you slaughtered it thinking, I'm going to sprinkle the blood beyond the designated time. Now, Then you continued, you put the blood on the altar, which if you remember, the blood, and that's the next words, ho'ilu miratzeh lepigulo. If you do the sprinkling of the blood in a pigul sacrifice, that actually is what causes the pigul prohibition to kick in to the eating of the meat, right? If you didn't do that, it's not actually pigul. Because in order for pigul to be, the meat to be called pigul, that if you eat it, you get karet, you have to do everything else in the right way. Now, it's a little weird because you're not supposed to do it that way. You're not supposed to sprinkle the blood. But the sprinkling of the blood is what causes the pigul to be called pigul, the meat to be called pigul, and for the karet issue to kick in. So now they say, what do you see there? You see there that blood being sprinkled is actually somewhat called done correctly. It's not done correctly because you weren't supposed to do it, but it's correctly to the extent that it causes the pigul to kick in. Well, if the sprinkling of the blood on the altar is considered like a good sprinkling of the blood, then we'll say that the burning of the parts on the altar is considered a proper burning, which means that if you put it on the altar, even though you shouldn't, you leave it there. Okay? So it's a little complex way of thinking, but yeah, you could see. Then once we have chutz l'zmano, chutz l'mkomo is going to be because ho'il dufu kash l'chutz l'zmano. They're both learned out from the same pasuk. So since, right, those two always go together. So if you had a thought that you're going to do it outside its designated time, I'll just remind you, there's no karet by chutz l'mkomo. There is karet by chutz l'zmano. Otherwise, they're really the same, although that's a big difference. But basically, it's considered similar. So whatever's true, right? If the chutz l'zmano can stay on the altar, obviously the chutz l'mkomo. Shekiblu psulim v'zarku damam. Last situation. This one's written a little bit differently. If non-kosher kohanim, meaning like a person who's impure, okay, and that's really going to be the example they're talking about. We'll see in a minute. Accepted the blood or sprinkled the blood. So bahanach psulin dechazu lavodat tzibur. Here they're not explaining why, but they're saying we're talking about here if psulim accepted the blood and then they continued and then put the blood on the altar or burn the meat, the parts of the meat, the parts of the animal that have to be burned on the altar. They continued with that sacrifice, even though it was done with an impurity. Done by an impure kohen, and it shouldn't have been done that way. It works because we're talking about psulin dechazu lavodat tzibur. Since kohanim could do communal offerings when they're impure in the situation where, again, this isn't the situation. But if all the Kohanim or the majority of the Kohanim were impure, or the majority of the people were impure, there is a way to bring a sacrifice by collecting the blood in a case of impurity. So, therefore, we'll be lenient here. If the Kohen who is impure collected the blood, then we can allow the blood to stay on, or the meat can stay on. Okay. But now we go back. So this Braita, again, all we wanted was lam b'imurim kasher because lam b'basar kasher, and lam b'dam kasher because lam b'imurim kasher. So now they say, but wait, and that was a binyanav and a binyanav. But they say this whole drasha makes no sense, both in that case and also in the next case of the Yotzei. And that's what I said. Can you learn something that's disqualified and then put on the altar from something that's completely not disqualified? The fact that meat can be eaten the next day, because it's totally fine to eat it, or you can bring things outside the Azarah when there's no temple, that you can't then learn to a case where it was actually disqualified. So that doesn't make any sense. And by the way, I just to make it clear, in the cases they're learning it from, were not cases where we put something on the altar. We're talking about the meat that you can eat the meat the next day. And the Yotzei, well, there it could be put on the altar, but that's an altar that's not in the temple. So it's not really a real comparison. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Okay, well then that's weird. The Braita said this. I had the Braita say it. It's not really learned from there. Even though the Braita said it's learned from there, that's not really where we learn it, which means we can't learn a binyanav from this sugya because that's not really how they learned it. How did they learn it? From a drasha. Tana mizot Torah ha'olah. Okay, this pasuk in Vayikra chapter 6, verse 2, that says these are the rules for the olah. Hi ha'olah u'magdal mizbeach. This is the olah that goes on the altar. They make a drasha here. Zot Torah ha'olah. These are the rules for the olah, and then they say all sorts of things olah. They go up on the altar, and you don't have to take them down. It's a drasha. So they say from there riba. They add lots of cases, and samichle. That's what the author of this Braita relied upon. Really, the author of the Braita was relying on the drasha and the pasuk. Why the author of the Braita didn't say a good question. This is what you do when something doesn't make sense. And that with the author of the Braita was doing here, and this is why I pointed out how, and this is just my theory, but when it says lam b'basar, v'sharei lam b'murim, shelam b'basal, it's got a whole rhyme and it's got a whole sing-songy thing to it. They were doing it so you can remember it, right? In asmachta we call it. It's when we have a drasha sometimes from psukim and we say, oh, it's just not asmachta. They don't really learn it from the psukim. Here it's kind of the opposite. They really learn it from a pasuk. And when the Braita gave all those reasons, it was just like, okay, here's something that you can remember in your head, maybe as a mnemonic. We don't know why exactly, but it's not really where it comes from. It's not really. So there is no binyan av and a binyan av because that's not really the way it was derived, at least according to the way the Gemara concludes. And it's hard to learn the Braita otherwise because it really doesn't make so much sense. Okay, next topic. Sheyarei Adam. Okay, we're back to our Mishnah. If you remember, okay, in our Mishnah, the Sheyarei Adam, let's go back. We haven't been in the Mishnah in a while. We got sidetracked by all these cases. So the Mishnah had said that by the Chataot Pnimiyot, right, Parim and Nisrafim, Sirim and Nisrafim, okay, they do Shlitatam B'Tzafon, Kibul Duram B'Klei Sharei B'Klei Tzafon, all those, okay. And then we said, or the Parsir and Yom Kippurim, it doesn't really matter which one, Sheyarei Adam Haya Shofecha Yesod Ma'aravi Shel Mizbeach HaChitzon. So that remainders of the blood, and this is going to be our topic for the rest of today, the remainders of the blood would be poured on the western base of the outer altar. Okay, so let's talk again about the altar. The altar was 30 by 30. Then it ended up being 32 by 32 because it had this sovev, this area that jutted out on the top. And then it had also an area on the base that jutted out. Okay, now the area on the base juts out the length of an amma. Actually, when I think about it, right, both jut out an amma. Yeah, the base juts out an amma from the sovev, yeah. So now, that base only goes on two sides. But two sides that kind of extend out, we'll talk about in a minute. They extend on the western side, which again, if you're in the temple, if you're walking in the entrance, you're walking in from the east, and then it's on the opposite side of you, on the west, and it's on the north, which is the side where the slaughtering happened. That's how you can remember it in your head. The base juts out only on two sides, okay? It goes it's only on two sides of the altar. It's the whole length of that side of the west, the whole length of the north, okay? The west is basically opposite the sanctuary. That's what we're going to see right now. That's the important part. That's why you remember it, because when you walk out of the sanctuary, the opposite of when you walk into the room, you don't see it. It's on the far side. You don't see at least that side of it, the western part. When you walk out of the sanctuary, you see the western part. You can see the northern part when you're walking into the room, because that's on the side of you when you walk in. Now, if you think about this, okay, I want you to now think. So first of all, it went on both those sides and jutted out a little bit more. Okay, it extended out a little bit farther than that side. So now if you think about the three corners of the altar, where is there a base? Even though it's only on two sides, okay, all three corners that you're at, other than northeast, you're going to be near the base of the altar. Just so you understand that, because it goes on two sides. So imagine a square, right? And you draw two lines. So that makes a triangle itself. So that's three corners already. Okay, so that's important to understand for the continuation. Not yet, but soon. So now we're going to go to the Mishnah. Shirei Adam you do on the western side. You don't do it on the northern side where there's a base. You pour them on the base that's on the west. How do we get to that? My time. The pasuk by the Kohen HaMashiach, which describes this, said, I said northeast, sorry, southeast. I said that wrong. I meant southeast. Southeast has no corner. Thank you for correcting me. What I meant was the southeast corner has no yesod there. Okay? That's the only one. Apologize for the mistake. Okay, Amar Kra. El yesod mizbach ha'olah asher petach moed. It says specifically about the Kohen HaMashiach, that's the par inside. You're supposed to go outside, right? Put the blood on the yesod of the mizbech. Asher petach moed. Asher petach moed. What does that mean? It's opposite the sanctuary. So that's going to be obviously on the west side. Because when you walk out of the sanctuary, you walk right into the western side of the altar. It's a little farther from you, but that's what you're seeing. So, hahu depaga beresha. It's the one you see first when you get out of the Ol Moed. Okay, that's clear. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to note that the words, the psukim that say, take the remainder and pour it on the base of, now, I want you to see the whole pasuk, El Yesod Mizbach HaOlah. The Mizbech of the Olah. Why the Mizbech of the Olah? Okay, we're now going to see all these Mizbachot have multiple names. Okay, the one inside, let's start with, it's called the Mizbech HaPnimi, the inner one. Until now, we keep calling them the inner one, the outer one. It's also called the Mizbech HaZahav, because it's gold, as opposed to the Mizbech HaNechoshet, which is the outer one, which is Nechoshet. So the outer one's called the Mizbech Nechoshet, and it's called Mizbech HaChitzoni. Okay, so we have those two names. But then we also have another name for it. The inner altar is mostly used for Ktoret. So it's called the Mizbach HaKtoret. Okay, even though we use it for these unique offerings, but most of the time it's used daily for the Ktoret, they would offer twice the incense. And the outer altar is used, the majority of the sacrifices were Korbanot Olah, because also every day they were doing the Tamid, which is Korban Olah, and all sorts of voluntary offerings were brought as Korbanot Olah. So they're, right, how often people do sin, but the main offerings were the Olah, so it's called the Mizbech HaOlah. Okay? So fine, so the Pasuk calls it the Mizbech HaOlah. But then the Pasuk refers to this 3 times. Okay? There is no altar in the Kodesh Kodeshim. Okay? The altar in the sanctuary, the Heichal, is the Mizbeach HaPnimi. But there's no altar, I see from your question, there's no altar in the Kodesh Kodeshim. There's just the Aron. Okay? Now, if you remember, when the Kohen Gadol, what does he do? He brings his machta, he brings the coals, he brings the pan in, because there is no place to offer something there. Okay? There's no altar there. Now, what we're going to do now is say why in 3 psukim in Vayikra Daled, we know that parak very well. That's the one with the Par Kohen HaMashiach first, then the Par Helam Dever Shel Tzibur, then the Chatat HaNasi, and then the Chatat of the people. Today we're going to talk about the first 3. In the first 3, Kohen HaMashiach, Par Helam Dever Shel Tzibur, and the Nasi, it says, take the Shirayim and pour them El Yesod Mizbach HaOlah. And they're basically going to say, you didn't need to say this 3 times. So what are we going to darshan? And you didn't even need to say it once. We're going to talk later after we read this Braita. Why was it obvious to them that they could darshan this and it wasn't needed for its simple reading? But right now we're going to assume it's not necessary. And we're going to darshan all 3. Tana Rabbanan. So the first one is the Kohen HaMashiach, who everything is going on in the Heichal, in the sanctuary. Right? The blood and the blood gets put on the altar inside, the small one, that's the inner altar. And then you're going to walk out of the Heichal and pour the Shirayim on the Mizbach HaOlah. V'lo Yesod Mizbech HaPnimi. So the first one is telling you, you cannot put it on the base of the inner altar. Okay, you might be saying, what base of the inner altar? There is no base of the inner altar, and that's the next Rasha. El Yesod Mizbech HaOlah. Ein lo Yesod Mizbech Hatzmo. So the second time it's mentioned by the Parlam Dever Shel Tzibur is to tell you, you're going to put it in the base of the Mizbech HaOlah because there is, and just so you know, in case you thought otherwise, right, and don't make a base for the inner altar, there's no base to be made for the inner altar. Okay, it doesn't have a base. El Yesod Mizbach HaOlah. The third one, which is by the Nasi. Ten Yesod LeMizbech Shel Olah. Okay, what does that mean? It means make sure you have this halacha of Yesod, meaning that you pour the blood, whatever blood remains. By the way, this is only if there remains blood after you spill the blood. If there's no blood, there's nothing to do. But if there's blood remaining, you pour it on the base for every korban there is. And Rashi points out that it only says it in most korbanot, but it doesn't say it in the korban olah. And this is to teach you also for a korban olah, okay, and that's why the ten yisod mizbeach shel olah, on the altar of the olah, you're going to do yisod for every korban there is. Okay. Even if it didn't say so in the psukim. That's the third drasha. So now they ask about this last one. Maybe it's to tell you something else. Maybe it's to tell you that that when you sprinkle the blood on the altar, okay, the regular sprinkling, not the remainders, maybe it's trying to tell you only sprinkle, now we go back, the southeast side, now I said it right, southeast side has no yesod. When you sprinkle the blood on the corners of the altar, now there's different times where you do it on 2 corners, which are like 4, right? So you have to get it on all the sides, but you only have to do it on 2 corners. Which 2 corners? Choose 2 corners that have the yesod. When you're going to sprinkle the blood on the altar, it has to be where there's a base underneath. Don't sprinkle it on the southeast side. Now you can still get it on the south, because when you're on the southwest side, it'll get on the west and on the south. You pour the blood, right? What do? You take it in a cup. You're standing on the floor. Kohen throws it toward the altar, it gets on both sides. But don't stand where there's no yesod. Stand over there in the corners, in one of the three corners, where there is a yesod. Maybe it's coming to teach you that, which is actually a halacha. So maybe that's what it means. So now they say, Amar Rabbi Yishmael, no, because that you learn from a simple kavachomer. Kavachomer, mashirayim she'em mechaprim tunin yesod. If the remainder, which is really not important because it doesn't atone for anything, right? It's just the remainder and it's not critical part of the sacrificing. And it needs to be done where there's a base, right? On the base, tchilat olah shemechaperet eno din shetuna yesod. So when you start with a korban olah and you have to put the blood, the main part of the korban olah, and any korban really, right? Wouldn't it be obvious that it needs to be opposite the yesod? Would that be pretty clear? In other words, again, we might not have thought about this, but when you do the pouring, you pour it actually into the yesod. And now what they're saying is, obviously, we want any blood to trickle down into this yesod. So you're going to only do it on sides where there's a yesod. Okay, you're going to do it on corners, like stand in those corners there where there's a base. Or on the side of the altar. If you only need to do it on one side, then theoretically you don't stand by the corner. The corner, the whole benefit is if you're standing near the corner on the floor there and you throw it, it gets on both sides at once, right? That's the Shnei Matanot Shem Arba. We're going to get into all that later. I'm a Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is going to say the same thing as Rabbi Yishmael. What they're basically saying is, and he's just saying it in other words, it's really the exact same thing, is you don't need a pasuk for that. And that's why the pasuk doesn't teach you that, because it's learned out from a simple logical reasoning. And therefore, the pasuk is teaching you, even korbanot olah need yesod, even though it didn't say so in the Torah. So Amar Rabbi Akiva, same thing really. Ma shirayim she'em mechaplim, if the shirayim, the remainders, don't atone, ve'em ba'im lekapara, and they don't come for atonement purposes, tu'unim yesod, and they need the base, needing to be done into the base. Tchilat olah shemechaperet, uba lechapara, so the blood of the olah, which does atone, and the whole purpose of it is for atonement purposes, Eino din shetuna yesod, shouldn't it also need the yesod? Need to be done where there's a yesod. So im ken mata mudomar, finishing up the Braita, then why does it say el yesod mizbach ha'olah? To teach you ten yesod lemizbacha shel olah, which again means the law of yesod applies to all sacrifices. Again, only assuming there is a remainder of blood. If you threw the blood and everything came out of the cup, then there's nothing to talk about. Amar Mar. Now we're going to go back to two of the drashot, and that's where we're going to finish up our daf. El yesod mizbach ha'olah. So the first drasha we had, v'lo yesod mizbach ha'pnimi. Don't put it on the base of the pnimi, of the inner altar, right? And then the second one was there is no pnimi. So now they say, wait a minute. The first one, ha'mibayle legofe. Don't you need it to teach you? Do it on the yesod, on the outer altar, because why? Well, you're standing inside doing the blood on the inner altar. And then if they want to tell you the shirayim are done on the other altar, they need to tell you. You need to move and get to the other mizbeach. So isn't it needed to tell you? Now, I just want to point out two things. If you say do it on the outer, then it means you don't do it on the inner. And isn't that what this drasha is? But no, there's two things. First, you have to say, don't do it inside, do it outside. Go to the outer altar. However, you still could say within that, but if you did it on the base, on the inner altar, maybe you'd fulfill your obligation. In other words, it's not the way you're supposed to do it, but sometimes if you do things not exactly the way you're supposed to do it, they kind of work anyway. So that's what they're saying. If you read that pasuk, it sounds like it's telling you, go outside, because you wouldn't have known that otherwise. And that's all it's teaching you. It's not telling you, well, but if you happen to do it inside, it would be disqualified. So how do you get that it cannot be done on the inner altar, which is an added thing? So they answer, no, because you could already get the go outside, because what else does the pasuk say, right? Put it on the yesod mizbach ha'olah, asher al petach, what are the words? Asher petach ol moed. So it already tells you it's opposite the entrance of ol moed, which means you know then that you're outside. Because whenever they say opposite the entrance of ol moed, they're talking about you're outside and you're looking into the sanctuary. So basically, already from there we get that you have to be outside. So this adds something additional, which is, and by the way, if you do it inside, it's a major problem, right? It's not going to work. Okay, next drasha. Now we're skipping to the third drasha. They don't ask anything on the second one. El yesod mizbach ha'olah, ten yesod mizbach shel olah, which again we said was all korbanot also need the law of yesod, that you're going to have to pour the shirayim onto the base of an altar, okay, of the outer altar. Now, now, why don't you need this? Now, let's talk about it. The first one we have is the par of the Kohen Mashiach, which was done inside. And then it's telling you go outside, and in addition, which I didn't need to tell you because we already have that. It's telling you this other thing about there's no Yesod L'Mizbeach, that you can't do it on the inner. The second one, which now at this point is unnecessary because we already know from the first one it's going to be outside, that's teaching you there is no Yesod. Don't ever build a Yesod on the inner altar. Then we have a third one. But the third one is by the Nasi. The Nasi brings a simple sin offering, not a complicated, unique one that goes on the inner altar. It's all done on the outer altar. So, if you're going to say, Kiddichtiv, that this is obviously open to drasha. Why? Because you don't need to say, put it on the outer altar, the remainder of the blood. You're already outside, right? So, Hane Lama Li cry, right? What would this pasuk be needed for the simple reading? The shirayim, to tell you about the remainders. But shirayim, and then that they go on the outer altar, on the right out of the outer one. Shirayim habarai avadluhu, but you're already outside. So obviously you're going to do it on the outer altar. So that's why it's an unnecessary pasuk. Okay, and that's why you can darshan it to something else. But now the Gemara wants to suggest something, and we'll just read this because we have a little time. We'll read, it starts on today's stuff, it goes into the next. You might have thought that, wait a minute, maybe it really does need to tell you the blood needs to go outside the shirayim, because you might have thought, what? Maybe everything's flipped. What does that mean? Maybe when you're doing the blood on the inner altar, the remainder goes on the outer altar. And when you're doing the blood on the outer altar, the remainder goes on the inner altar. You might have thought that. And then you would say, therefore, maybe the pasuk is needed for itself and it's not open to drasha. But what's the obvious response here? But there is no yesod. In other words, we already darshan from the previous, we know. There is no base on the inner one. So there would have no thought that I would have gone inside, which means obviously I'm going to be on the outer altar. So therefore, the pasuk is unnecessary, and therefore it teaches us that Tein lo yesod l'mizbeach shel olah, that all korbanot have remainders of blood. You need to put the blood on the base, even if the Torah didn't say so. Okay, what we did today was pretty simple. We took we finished up. The first thing we did was we rejected the Kal V'chomer. Can you do a binyan av and a Kal V'chomer? We thought yes from Rabbi Meir. Then we said no, you can't do that because that's chulin. You can't learn it from there, or at least maybe there's two options here, but it's not clear. Then we went to the binyan av. Can you do all those things after a binyan av? We didn't have a possible even answer for any of them other than binyan av and binyan av. The lam b'basar, which was learned, right, teaches to lam b'murim. Lam b'murim teaches to lam b'dam. But binyan av, binyan av. But then we rejected it. We said, no, lam b'basar can't teach you about lam b'murim. They're two completely different things, right? One is permitted and one is just, right, one is kosher, one is not, right, disqualified, one is completely disqualified. Can't learn that from that. That's not a binyan av. It must really be learned from some other pasuk, and they just kind of connected it to there. Then we went to the Shairei Adam. How do we know that from the outer offerings it's done on the western side? And that's because it says Petach HaMoed, right? When you leave, that's the first part you're going to get to, the western side of the Yesod. Then we had these three mentions of El Yesod Mizbach HaOlah. They all said the exact same thing. Why did it say it three times? And then we had to show how we know at least the first one and the last one were unnecessary. Well, the truth is the second one's obviously unnecessary because once you have the first one, the second one's unnecessary, and then we had to show why the first and the third are unnecessary. And that's what we proved, and that's how we get to those Rashad. And we did have one question within there. Maybe the third one was teaching some other halacha, and they said, oh, that halacha we could get from logical inference. We don't need a pasuk for it. With that, we finished today's daf. Wishing everyone a good day.